Prime Minister Scott Morrison really sought to capitalise on national security early on in the election campaign, but the announcement of a security pact between China and the Solomon Islands forced the coalition onto the defensive. Joining us live now is Peter Dean. He's the Chair of Defence Studies at the University of Western Australia. Peter, good to see you. Thanks for your time. We spoke with you at the very start of the campaign and you were expecting a so-called khaki election with a big focus on defence matters. And we have seen defence, national security, the Solomons, China. They've certainly been consistent themes, especially for the coalition throughout the past few weeks. It really came to a crescendo a few days ago when Peter Dutton was warning about this Chinese ship being off the WA coast. Was that warning legitimate or was it pure politics a week out from an election?
Well, I'd have to say a week out from the election where the sort of khaki election component of this campaign has not run as well for the government as I hoped. It looked very much more like, for Peter Dutton, a bit of a last throw of the dice on national security. Certainly, as Minister in his former role, he didn't really want to talk about on-water matters. Suddenly, he wanted to talk about this Chinese ship. And then I think he went a step too far when he was talking about it being an act of aggression because the ship remained in international waters and, of course, followed very similar mission profiles to what Australian ships do in the region and in particular in areas like the South China Sea. So it's proven very difficult for the government. They certainly went in, as you said, into the campaign looking for a khaki election. But I think two key factors has really played against them so far in the campaign. That is friction and chance. So friction is basically when, the little things seem to suddenly become really hard. And early on in the campaign, it became really hard to get some traction on this issue for a number of reasons for the government. And then the Solomon Islands was the chance element that came along, and it's really hurt the government on this particular debate area. And in fact, it's turned it from a coalition strength, I would argue, in this campaign to something that not only can the Labor Party neutralise, but in fact turn to their advantage in the final weeks of the campaign at the moment.
And was the Solomons issue purely chance, as you're suggesting? I mean, we have seen some analysts saying that China may be trying to intervene in Australia's election, that the timing of the Solomons deal with China could have been timed to try and hurt the coalition. Are we inflating our own self-importance a bit too much here, or do you think China is trying to meddle?
Oh, look, I think this is a classic case of a little from column A and a little from column B. I mean, as we know, it was August last year this deal was started to be in play that we knew about. At least it's been in train between the Solomons and China for a very long period of time. So, and of course, the Australian government gets to decide when the election is called. So that was a choice that Scott Morrison made. Could it be that short term that the Chinese or the Solomon Islands tried to make a little bit out of this given the election campaign? Well, that may well be the case as well. So I don't think it was a broad, deliberate plan from China or the Solomon Islands to time this around the election, but I think there might have been a bit of opportunism that had come along. So it's a combination of these things that come together. So the coalition had planned to run on national security, khaki election type issues, but it had a few holes in its strategy coming in. Opinion polls put Labor ahead of handling the relationship with China. Both parties' opinion polls said we're evenly balanced on dealing with the war in the Ukraine. Certainly the government wanted to talk about defence spending. It wanted to talk about its tough record on China. But as the Solomon Islands issue evolved, that meant the government got onto the back foot, not just because they were in power and this happened under their watch, but it also exposed some issues they had around coordinating all elements of national power, particularly foreign aid funding, diplomacy and other elements that play into national security. And of course, in the past, the real strong areas for national security for the government, the coalition, have been border security and terrorism in the past. We saw that the Prime Minister has tried on a number of occasions to sort of and bring in border security into the campaign. We saw Anthony Albanese make a big stumble in the first election debate, but that's not really got any purchase or really any traction for the government in this particular campaign. So, and it's allowed the Labor Party to also reposition their own diplomatic approaches, their own plans around the region. And of course, the big attack by Peter Dutton about Labor's record in defence spending is starting to look a bit stale because the coalition's now been in government for 9 years, over 4 terms. And I think Brendan O'Connor did a reasonable job at countering that by comparing the Howard government defence era spending to the Gillard and Rudd government defence spending, which is roughly the same.
Penny Dean, I'm just going to alert our viewers to the fact that Mark McGowan, the WA Premier, and Anthony Albanese, the opposition leader, are about to hold a news conference any moment now. So apologies in advance, Peter, if I do need to cut you off, but we are just watching these live pictures coming in of Anthony Albanese again side by side with the WA Premier on the election trail campaign in Perth. He's at a manufacturing facility there. Looks like they're just doing some meet and greets first with the workers, and when that news conference gets underway, you can be sure we'll take you right back live there to Perth. Penny Dean, before I do let you go, I was keen to know, are there any particular seats, do you think, where defence issues will actually come to the fore and be a vote changer? And in terms of defence issues broadly, you mentioned some of the big issues there of defence spending, the war in Ukraine, China. What is it that voters actually care about in that national security space?
Well, I think what's been very interesting watching the media coverage, particularly a lot of the Vox Pops people, journalists talking to people in the community about how many of them have raised China and international security as an issue that they're concerned about. The question is, will that really play more broadly into any specific seat-by-seat particular part of the equation? Now, there are some seats in WA, in Queensland and South Australia in particular where there's a high concentration of defence manufacturing, military bases, or people who are involved in defence industry where it may play a specific role in a seat-by-seat basis. But I think what it's more broadly playing into is some of these national polls that we're seeing. Now, the key question, the unknown factor for this is how that's going to play out on election day. But I think there's one interesting analogy we can draw from this. At the last election, Scott Morrison beat Bill Shorten by a very wide margin on national security issues. I believe one poll put it something at 14 points. In particular, we saw there that border security and refugees played a significant role in the last week of the campaign, and that was seen as a very big positive for Scott Morrison. And certainly that meant that he was allowed to utilise this issue as part of his run home in that final week to the polls and to his miracle victory, as many people have called it. This time around, it hasn't gone the coalition's way, I'd have to argue. They haven't got the purchase on border security that they would like. The attacks on Labor around China have been undone by the Solomon Islands issue and the government having to defend its own record. So I think if Scott Morrison can come from behind again on Saturday, and there's still a likelihood that that will happen, this time, though, I don't think national security is going to play anywhere near the important role as what it did in the last election. And I think that's going to make it even more difficult for him to make up ground in the final week of the campaign.
Penny Dean, really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.